I remember Rick doing Hello, Mary Lou and some of the standards, which were always fun to play. I mean, you grow up...
He was known as the quiet one, a man who kept his head down while the spotlight swirled around his bandmates. But in the final chapter of his life, Randy Meisner, co-founder of the Eagles, did something nobody expected. At 77, as he battled chronic illness and neared the end, he revealed the names of 7 musicians he could never forgive. 7 individuals who, in his eyes, carried shadows that never left him. This wasn't some outburst or gossip column twist. It was real, raw. The kind of truth that doesn't show up until the lights fade and the applause stops. And topping that list? Glenn Frey. It's hard to imagine a time when Randy and Glenn weren't at odds. But there was one. In the beginning, their bond sparked with promise. It started at the iconic Troubadour in Los Angeles in the early 70s, when both were still finding their voices and identities in the industry. Randy once shared how the band's name was born after a moment of desert stillness, watching an eagle soar overhead. A vision, a name, a legacy in the making. But something deeper began to simmer underneath. Glenn was a natural in the spotlight. Charismatic, confident, loud when he needed to be. Randy? He played from the heart, but let his music speak. While Frey commanded the stage, Meisner hung back, the quiet heartbeat of a band about to take over the world. That contrast wasn't just noticeable, it was combustible. As Frey and Don Henley's partnership grew tighter, the balance of power began to shift. Randy once called them the Lennon and McCartney of the Eagles, not as a compliment, but as a quiet acknowledgement of his own fading place at the table. By the time the Hotel California tour rolled around, Randy's inner battle was turning into something much louder. June 1977, Knoxville, Tennessee. One of the most pivotal nights in the band's history. The fans were buzzing, the stage lights were hot, and the crowd wanted one thing: take it to the limit. A song Randy had poured himself into, but one that now haunted him with its high notes and emotional weight. Struggling with health issues and anxiety, he asked to skip it. What happened next would fracture the band forever. Frey, never one to back down, reportedly tried to coax him back. "It's fine, man. Just get out there and sing it." But when Randy said no, the tension erupted. "Then why don't you just quit?" Frey allegedly snapped. It didn't stop there. There was shouting, a scuffle, and, as the story goes, even a punch thrown. Security stepped in, but Henley waved them off, calling it a personal matter that needed to stay in-house. For Randy, it wasn't just another night on tour. It was the beginning of the end. Still, he stayed on through September 1977, closing out his final show with the Eagles in East Troy, Wisconsin. But those last months were agonizing. "Nobody talked to me," he said later. "It was like I didn't exist." He felt replaced, diminished. No longer a founding member, but a player for hire in a band he helped create from the ground up. His last major contribution on Hotel California? A single track, "Try and Love Again." Buried deep near the end of the album, a whisper in the roar of the band's success. And yet, even with all the hurt, all the betrayal, Randy never allowed bitterness to consume him. When Glenn Frey passed in 2016, Randy's response wasn't anger. It was grief. "I cried for hours," he admitted. "We fought like brothers, but we loved each other like brothers too." That kind of reflection, so tender and honest, wasn't what fans expected. But it spoke volumes about who Randy really was. What if everything you thought you knew about a band was only half the truth? What if the real drama never made it into the liner notes? There's something haunting about watching a man look back on a life where music soared, but relationships fractured. Randy Meisner's story isn't just about feuds or fame, it's about the toll success can take when your voice gets drowned out, not by the crowd, but by the ones standing next to you. Even decades later, the ripples from that Knoxville showdown continued to affect how Meisner remembered the band. "It wasn't all bad," he once said, "but it was painful to see how far apart we all drifted." While fans clung to the harmonies, behind the scenes, silence grew louder than applause. That divide, once hidden, now echoes through interviews, memoirs, and this final revelation, his unfiltered truth. What haunted Randy the most in his final years wasn't just the arguments or the years of silence. It was the ache of something that never happened. He had held on to the hope, quietly and deeply, that one last reunion might be possible. He had even marked the Kennedy Center honors on his calendar, thinking maybe, just maybe, they'd all be in the same room again, share a laugh, make peace. That chance never came. And that quiet heartbreak, the kind that lives between the lines, was the one that stung the most. The kind you don't sing about, but you feel forever. When Randy fell into a serious health scare around 2013, it was the very bandmates he had once felt pushed out by, Don and Glenn, who stepped in with compassion. He had accidentally inhaled food while eating, and it triggered a medical emergency, one that left him unconscious in a hospital for a while. He later said, with genuine gratitude, that the Eagles covered the entire cost of his care. That moment of grace didn't erase the past, but it did reveal something deeper. Beneath the bitterness, there was still brotherhood. And when Glenn passed away in 2016, Randy broke down. The same man he'd once clashed with on stages and in dressing rooms. He cried for him. Randy said he cried for a long time that day, because for all their fighting and differences, the memories ran deep. He said, "It's like being in a marriage. You love each other, even when you fight. And now I'll never get to tell him that again." He referenced the song that had torn them apart, softly adding, "It hurts that we couldn't take it to the limit just once more." It wasn't just a song. It had become the symbol of everything they couldn't fix. But the storm didn't stop with Glenn. Randy had another name on his quiet list of regrets and rivalries. Don Henley. A force of nature in the Eagles, Don had taken on a towering presence, one that made the air around Randy grow thinner as the years passed. It wasn't about jealousy. It was about imbalance. The spotlight had narrowed, and Don and Glenn stood firmly in the center of it, casting a long shadow over the others. Randy wasn't looking to be the star, but he didn't want to feel erased. Henley once said in an interview that bands worked best as benevolent dictatorships. He said it casually, but Randy felt the full weight of that line. Don and Glenn had shaped the band's sound, direction, and image. Randy respected that, but he also watched as his own creative space grew smaller and smaller. He later described it as going from being a founder to feeling like a sideman in his own band. You don't forget that kind of slow fade. And when the Eagles reunited years later in the 90s, that gap became even more obvious. Financially, creatively, Don and Glenn called the shots. Reports suggested they arranged for a disproportionate share of earnings, a stark shift from the early days when everything was split evenly. For Randy, it wasn't just about money. It was about being seen, being heard, being acknowledged as someone who helped build the house, not just someone brought in to clean up. But the differences weren't just about business. They ran deep into the music itself. Randy had grown up on gritty R&B, soul, and upbeat rock and roll. He liked things raw, loud, full of life. Don and Glenn, especially Don, leaned toward polished harmonies and structured storytelling. In one of Randy's interviews, he confessed, "I'm probably the only one in the band who liked funky, messy music. I never fit the image." That honest divide in taste meant he often felt like he was swimming upstream, out of step with the band's evolution. And while Randy kept his emotions tucked away, Don didn't. In the official History of the Eagles documentary, Don painted Randy in a less-than-kind light, calling him a hypochondriac and a real pain to work with. That kind of remark stung, not just because of the words themselves, but because they shaped how millions of fans would remember him. The Knoxville incident, which Randy always said was about exhaustion and illness, was portrayed as if he had simply been irresponsible. That one night became a defining chapter, and Don's version became the dominant narrative. It's no secret that the documentary heavily favored Henley and Frey. They were the main songwriters, yes, and they had successful solo runs. But it meant Randy's voice, his version of events, got lost in the background. It was another moment where he wasn't centered in the story he helped write. Why did Randy finally speak up at 77? Why name those 7 musicians after decades of silence? He wasn't looking for revenge. He was reflecting, with all the clarity that age brings. He wasn't just airing grievances. He was unpacking a lifetime of memories, regrets, and truths. And when he spoke, he didn't scream. He whispered. But the truth in his voice was loud enough to echo. Here's the part that turns everything upside down. Because, name number 1, that's where things start to unravel in ways no one could have expected. It wasn't about fame or fights or fallout. It was about loyalty and betrayal. And how the smallest moment, one missed call, one cold glance, can become a wound that never quite closes. Some names on his list made sense. Others? They shocked even those closest to him. The world saw Randy Meisner as the quiet eagle. The guy who hit the high notes, smiled through the tension, and faded from the spotlight with grace. But behind that calm exterior was a man who had carried more weight than he ever let on. His late-life confessions weren't bitter. They were human, honest, necessary. He wasn't trying to tear anyone down. He was finally trying to make peace with the truth. The atmosphere within the band grew increasingly tense. While Joe Walsh brought undeniable energy and flair, his presence also tilted the group's chemistry in a direction that left Randy Meisner further marginalized. For Meisner, it was as if the band had shape-shifted around him. What started as a harmony-driven collective had become a high-octane rock machine. Walsh was the lightning bolt, the fan favorite, and the life of the party. But behind the scenes, the shift isolated Meisner even more. And as the band's creative decisions began aligning with Walsh's style, Meisner's emotional and musical footing started slipping. And here's where it gets heartbreaking. At the same time, Meisner was battling inner demons. He was also silently struggling with declining health and limited industry support. While Joe Walsh maintained his grip on fame and public affection, Meisner became something of a ghost in the Eagles' mythology, present in the legacy, but missing from the spotlight. The contrast couldn't be more glaring. Even as Walsh went on to collaborate with legends and perform at sold-out arenas, Meisner's phone stopped ringing. One of the most overlooked betrayals in Meisner's story was not loud or violent. It was the silence. No one came forward to defend his place. Not when the documentary skewed his story, not when reunion tours skipped his name, and not even when his financial health began to unravel. And yet, the final curtain had one last twist. In 2023, when news broke of Randy Meisner's passing, the outpouring of tributes poured in from those who had once stayed quiet. Felder's words were tender. Walsh shared throwback stories. Even Henley acknowledged Meisner's role. But many fans asked, why did it take death for everyone to remember his voice? The emotional tension surrounding Meisner's final years isn't just about band politics. It's about how easily legacy can be rewritten, how memory becomes a weapon in the hands of the powerful. This wasn't just a fallen friendship, it was a reshaped narrative, carefully produced, conveniently selective. Still, for all the silence Randy Meisner endured, he never stopped being the quiet soul of the Eagles. His high falsetto on "Take It to the Limit" remains etched into classic rock history. And while he never got the Hollywood ending he deserved, his story has sparked a larger conversation about how power dynamics shape who gets remembered and who fades away. But let's zoom out and examine what makes Meisner's story even more tragic when compared to the empire others built in his absence. Take Don Henley, who, despite the controversy, transformed into a financial powerhouse. He owns several properties, including a sprawling ranch in Texas and luxury homes in Malibu. His collection of cars includes vintage Cadillacs and sleek Mercedes-Benz models. He's often spotted wearing high-end timepieces like Patek Philippe and Rolex. Henley also maintained a legacy jet, reportedly a Gulfstream G450, for long-haul tours and private getaways. Business-wise, Henley co-founded the Walden Woods Project, blending philanthropy with legacy building. He inked multi-million-dollar deals through Eagles's catalog sales, with some estimates valuing his stake north of $200 million. He's also held various insurance policies covering not only his touring life, but his music royalties, an unusual yet savvy move that protected his earning streams well into retirement. Financial analysts say Henley's discipline, investing heavily in real estate and preserving publishing rights, could serve as a case study in long-term wealth preservation for musicians. Yet while Henley's financial fortress remains intact, Meisner's later life was shadowed by mounting hospital bills and strained income. His medical expenses were partially offset by former bandmates, but it was a bittersweet reminder that his voice had value, only when he could no longer use it. Fans who once heard that soaring falsetto now wondered how a man who helped sell millions of records could die with so little. This imbalance between fame and fortune, between recognition and reward, feels like the cruelest footnote in Meisner's tale. It forces us to ask, what does it cost to speak out in an industry where the loudest voices write history? Even Joe Walsh, despite his personal chaos and recovery journey, managed to reinvent himself. A longtime advocate for sobriety and mental health, Walsh transitioned from wild card to elder statesman. His performances continued to electrify, and he tapped into mentorship roles with rising artists. Walsh may have walked through fire, but he emerged with purpose and a massive legacy. So, when we think about Randy Meisner today, it's no longer just about that final high note in Take It to the Limit. It's about the emotional cost of artistry, the quiet toll of being pushed to the edge, and the importance of remembering the ones who helped build empires but never got to rule them. As fans rediscover his voice, they're also uncovering a story long buried beneath platinum records and PR-approved documentaries. And here's the part that still stings. This wasn't just Randy's struggle. It's a cautionary tale for every underdog, every forgotten member, every voice that once soared and was later silenced. Because sometimes, the ones who gave us the most beautiful music were the ones screaming the loudest inside. So next time you hear that iconic chorus, pause. Listen closely. Not just to the notes, but to the man behind them, and the silence that followed.